I'm joined by Yozo Yokota, who's president of the Japan Center for Human Rights and Training. Professor Yokota, thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed.
My pleasure.
Perhaps you can give us a brief synopsis of your career, starting from your days as a student at Tokyo University.
Yes, I started to work on international economic law, specializing in the legal aspects of the World Bank. And then I went to Washington to work for the legal department of the World Bank to combine my academic research with practical experience for 2 years there. And then I started to teach at various universities, starting with International Christian University, and then later the University of Tokyo, and most recently Chuo University.
How did you come to be interested in human rights law?
That's an interesting question. Initially, I started off as a specialist in international economic law, way back in the 60s. And in those days, no one in the field of international economic law was interested in human rights. It's a separate issue for most economic law specialists. But when I started to work for the World Bank in the 70s, the World Bank was faced with serious human rights problems. As an economic institution, the first big issue was loans to South Africa, which was practicing apartheid policy, the discriminatory policy against African population there. And then we also faced the problem of loans to Chile under Pinochet regime, and also the Philippines under Marcos, and a little later to South Korea under Park Chung-hee, all dictators. And so the question was whether the World Bank should make loans to those dictatorial countries or discriminatory countries. And so I had to cope with this issue as a lawyer. And that was how I was involved in the human rights issue.
And subsequently, you were named as special rapporteur to Myanmar.
Yes.
How did that appointment come about?
Initially, that work was given to Mrs. Sadako Ogata. She later became a worldly known leader of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees Office. But because she was appointed as High Commissioner for Refugees, she had to give that mandate of special rapporteurship for Myanmar to somebody else. And through negotiations between the United Nations, the Japanese government, and the government of Myanmar, they came to agree on my appointment.
And when were you in Myanmar? Which years?
That was from 1991 through 96.
Through 1991-96. So at that period, the military powers were still very much in control of the country. Can you give us a brief overview of what Myanmar was like and its problems at that particular point?
Yes. Around 1960s, the military regime established a stronghold over the whole population of Myanmar. And under General Ne Win, he is the leader of the military, ruled the country for several decades. And late in 1980s, in fact in 1988, the students and young monks started street demonstrations against Ne Win government. And the government suppressed this democratic movement viciously. Several thousand people were killed, and more than 10,000 people were injured or somehow maltreated. And during that time, the famous Aung San Suu Kyi was back from England to Myanmar to take care of her old mother. And so she started to be involved in this democratic movement, and she became the leader of the democratic movement. That means the enemy of the military regime. And so the United Nations started to look into the situation in Myanmar at that time and felt that somebody from the United Nations should be appointed to look into the human rights situation in Myanmar. Mrs. Ogata was appointed as a special rapporteur first, and then quickly she had to assume another important position as High Commissioner for Refugees, and I succeeded her.
When you went to Myanmar, were you hopeful that you could be an agent for positive change, or did you feel you had what did you feel your remit was when you went?
Of course, I have never taken up such a big responsibility as a special rapporteurship in Myanmar at that time, so I had no basis to judge whether I can do the job correctly or not. But I knew that the situation was really difficult, and I just thought that I just carry out the mandate given to me. That means look into the human rights situation in Myanmar and then report back to the United Nations. The members of the Commission on Human Rights, now it is the Human Rights Council, but at that time it was called Commission. The Commission was to discuss and decide on the basis of the report I give. My responsibility was to give correct, true information, because the government is giving different stories. The opposition parties are giving another stories, and the UN had to rely on the most accurate information, and I thought that that was my responsibility. Now, how this will affect the discussion at the United Nations and how effective that might be to change Myanmar into a democratic society, that's something I could not predict at that time.
The situation in Myanmar has improved markedly since you were there. Are you hopeful that the situation will continue to improve? Do you think that the improvements we've seen in terms of the introduction of limited democracy are sustainable?
Yes, in response to your direct question, I would say positive and sustainable, but very slow. In other words, you cannot expect radical democratic change. It will take a long way, and patience is needed. The government is still a military government. The constitution is not truly democratic. It doesn't reflect the views of the mass of Myanmar populations. And also, they have to take into account the views of the minority groups, which are not well taken into account in the current constitutional process. So I think constitution eventually has to be amended to be more democratic, and that will take a long time. But I don't think the military will go back to 5-10 years before for much repressive attitudes towards people.
Let's move from Myanmar to the Asia in general.
Okay.
Asia's interesting, and it's hugely diverse in the types of governments there are, ranging from the dictatorships we see in North Korea,
yes,
through to Japan, which has grown into a modern and well-functioning
yes,
democracy.
Mm-hmm.
How difficult is it to work in the field of international human rights
in Asia?
In Asia, and as relates to international law? What is international law in the Asian context?
Okay. International law in general, I think all Asian countries share the same view. So I don't see the difference. But when it comes to human rights, or international human rights law more specifically, the views in Asia differ from country to country. Some Asian countries have been saying that human rights standards have been created and insisted by the European countries. And Asian countries have old cultures and traditions different from the European tradition. Therefore, Europeans should not try to judge human rights situation in Asian countries, applying the standards developed in their own societies. That's basically some of the views expressed by, for example, Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore and Mahathir of Malaysia. And even Marcos, the Philippines, said that applying European developed human rights standards to Asian countries is a new wave of colonialism.
And how do you feel about that criticism?
I disagree with this, the so-called Asian human rights values and so on. Human rights, by definition, must be shared by all the people on the globe. Human means not Asian, but everyone on the earth. And in fact, I have been working in the United Nations for Myanmar, and also a little later, more generally, the human rights discourse fora at the United Nations. And many experts come from Asia, from Islamic countries, from African countries, from Latin American countries, from European countries, Eastern European as well as Western European. We have different cultural, religious, ethnic backgrounds. And yet, when it comes to discussing human rights on specific issues, the status of women, migrant workers, indigenous populations, and so on, no one speaks for the culture they come from. I know a few very good Islamic experts of human rights. They never say, I say it from the Islamic tradition or Islamic religious point of view. They say human rights. And a lot of things they say, I completely agree with. I come from Asia, I come from Buddhist tradition and so on, and yet I can share completely with the views expressed by Islamic experts on human rights. And the same is true of Catholic experts from Latin America, for example. And I think at the United Nations level, no one pays serious attention to the cultural, religious, ethnic differences on human rights. So I think Asian views are just a defensive rationale for defending their human rights situation, which they themselves recognize as not well respected.
You're here to be the keynote speaker at this conference, which encompasses business management, politics, economics and law. As you know, the IAFOR conferences are international, intercultural and interdisciplinary. So we're looking at people from these different professions and academic backgrounds. And the theme of this year's conference is one of governance. And in your current role as president of the Center for Human Rights and Training in Japan, how are you working towards ensuring that human rights is a concept that business addresses?
Yes. Initially, our center was more focused on disseminating the concept of human rights through the general public. We held lecture series, symposia, and sometimes special course for general public to learn about human rights. But now, because of the importance of business enterprises in protecting and promoting human rights, we are focusing more and more on business aspects of human rights. And we now conduct seminars and symposia specifically focused on business and human rights. And sometimes we train the staff of various companies who are specialized in human rights issues in each company, how to educate and train the company staff to be more sensitive to human rights. And we also prepare leaflets, the textbooks for using lecture series for each companies to train their staff.
How is this received by the senior management of Japanese companies?
Rather surprisingly, and I'm pleased actually the reaction of the company executives. Many of them are all welcoming our approach to those companies to be more sensitive to human rights. And in fact, company executives do say that we are all trying to cooperate with the efforts made by governments and various NGOs and experts on human rights. And we try to abide by the standards to be applied to companies for a human rights point of view. So generally speaking, company executives are quite cooperative and understanding the efforts we make. But when it comes to concrete situations, still it takes time to relate company policies and decisions with the sensitivity to human rights. And that is where I'm trying to give hints to company executives. This is how you can pay particular attention to human rights aspect when you decide on investment in Myanmar, for example. We don't say don't invest in Myanmar. When you go to Myanmar, pay this special attention to certain human rights aspect in that country. And that is well received by the company leaders.
Professor Yokota, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.